I have a question for you. What do you do as the leader when you face massive uncertainty? Planning and execution is obviously not an option because you can't plan when you don't know what to plan for. But the one thing you can do, according to Professor Erlend Dehlin from NTS University in Norway, is you can improvise. And this is what we're going to talk about. Erlend is a huge proponent of practice theory, which means he's not only theoretically experienced, but he also knows the practice side of things. So I'm very much looking forward to hear from him how we as leaders can improvise. But before we go there, I want to introduce you to Wiebke van Bounska. Wiebke is the CEO and founder of Manage Magazine, who has collaborated with us to bring to you this series on motivation. Hi, Wiebke.
Thank you, Ingo. Thank you, everybody, for stopping by today. It's a joy seeing you here. Manage Magazine I created to get the research, sort of connect research with practice. And I was a little bit disturbed to see how that a lot of the research that we're doing as scholars are sitting in databases and we don't have access to it. So that was a lot of shame, I thought, and I wanted to sort of connect the two and create a platform where everybody who's interested in research and expertise in general about leadership and management have a chance to go and connect with this data and this knowledge, so they have a chance also to implement it in practice. So we're hoping to that you'll join us at Manage Magazine, and if you also have some expertise yourself, you're really welcome also to write articles.
Thank you, Wiebke. And with that, to the conversation between Wiebke and Erlend and how we can improvise as leaders.
Thank you. It's an honor to be invited both to Manage Magazine and to School of Becoming. It's and it's a new format as well, and I can see some friends popping up here on the screen now. Hi, Tyrone.
Hi, Tyrone.
And Elena as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will just start right away by sort of framing why we were talking about this particular topic.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, one thing is we want to, of course, introduce you to what is improvisation, but just to start out, maybe see why is it perhaps particularly important right now during these times of transition that we talk about improvisation.
Yeah, exactly, because it's all about uncertainty, right? And so from two perspectives, I would say this is particularly relevant right now because, uncertainty in these times of crisis creates some turbulence, some strategic challenges that are rare, that are out of the ordinary. But basically, it's the same kind of challenge that every business is in anyway. It's just more, is as if you just put a magnifying glass on it, right? So it's more evident now. You can see it more clearly what the challenges are. So if leadership is a way of organizing labor, that's just one perspective, right? But if you see it like that, and organizing is a way of dealing with uncertainty, the more vivid this uncertainty is, the clearer you see the improvisation as an aspect of that. Right. Not just an aspect maybe, but maybe even the very foundation. But some organizations, they keep on doing what they did yesterday because that's what they know how to do, right? Which is, that could work if you're lucky. But otherwise, strategy should not be just sticking to the old stuff. It should more be like a tool for improvisation, basically. So that's one perspective from an organizational view point, and also from the management point of view, as the staff, as the workers that you're leading tend to be knowledge workers nowadays, which often have a calling, they have passion for their work, and they, pretty much work to make a difference in this world. And the way they make this difference is by way of improvisation. That's my perspective anyway. They thrive in dealing with uncertainty. So that's actually their motivation a lot of the time, which basically puts improvisation in the middle of, everything, really.
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
Right. And I assume that continuing to doing what you did yesterday during times and transitions, when you actually need new solutions to new problems, it can be a great loss of meaning for knowledge workers to exist in that environment.
That's a very good point, because motivation, obviously it's an interesting phenomenon, but maybe, especially for knowledge workers, maybe motivation comes from meaning, right? A sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. So if improvisation is to create meaning, well, improvisation is motivation in itself, really, intrinsic to it,
Could you say a little bit about what made you research improvisation? Why was it that you started to focus on this topic?
Oh, concept? Sure. Well, many years ago, I was a captain in the Air Force, and I was managing this department of controllers, and I didn't seem to find the solutions, whatever I needed to, in everyday settings to make things work. It wasn't in the textbooks, right? It seemed to be something missing in the textbooks. All the models, all the plans, all the structures. But it seemed like the more I planned, the less the plan fitted next day. I was reminded of, it's a little bit blunt though, but I recently heard this quote from Mike Tyson. So he said that the plan goes out the window as soon as you're punched. That's a little bit, it's rough, but basically and that's my experience. I couldn't really find how to find a place to go to find inspiration to perform on an everyday level. So I had this, it needs to be something missing in the textbooks on management, on leadership, right? So that was the one thing. But I also had an interest in music, and especially jazz music. So I sort of connected the dots, I guess. And also I have this sales company that seems to be all about improvisation. Like sales to me is improvisation. You need to create a meaning with those customers that you're trying to sell to, right? That makes for a good sale. So those three things together all added up to improvisation, really. Right. And with this interest in philosophy, especially like that was later, but practice theory, as Ingo mentioned, well, that was. And I just want to make a short note on what Ingo says, because we often talk about a practice theory divide, or bridging the gap between theory and practice, as if they were separate to begin with. Right. I don't think they are.
Right. You might want to, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Some might say, what are you actually thinking when you say that?
Well, from a practice theoretical perspective, models, theories are only perfect in theory, but we don't live in theory, we live in practice. Whenever we talk about a theory, we think about a theory, that's a practice of theorizing.
Right.
So theory is practice, which means that all practices are theoretical as well, because when we think about them, we theorize about those practices. So it's basically the same thing, but it's hard to communicate something which is the same thing, so we tend to categorize a little bit, and which is fine, as long as we don't make them into beings unto their own, right? So beings in themselves, right? So entities.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That makes totally sense.
Okay.
And I also know that you have a question that you would like to pose, maybe before we move on to talking about what is improvisation.
Yeah, because we actually prepared for this as well. The thing is that improvisation and preparation are not two different things, rather the opposite. So we prepared this question for you guys watching us, listening to us now. And if you could spend 10 seconds, or maybe 15, to go into your own work practice, your own work experience, and find an example of the last time you improvised at work. Like, the last time I improvised at work was when, right? And just think about that. And as soon as you can come up with something, put it in the chat so we can use it. You can pick from those examples and build on it. So I'll shut up for 15 seconds now and see what pops up on the chat. See, that's a good one. We went off schedule. When do we not go off schedule? That's a really good one, right? Because you need your schedule. Then again, that's just a schedule. It doesn't give value in itself. You need to breathe the schedule into life, and the way you do that is by way of improvisation, right? So Fantastic.
Also, schedule as a tool.
Exactly.
In your words.
The schedule is a tool.
Right.
Now, this is good parent improvisation. I would like to know more about that. Is parenthood improvisation? Yes, it is. Indeed. Whenever I hear parents saying, okay, we have 3 kids and we raise them all the same, I'm a little bit skeptical and maybe even right, because if they're right, we make for a particular regime, I guess, for the kids, because they're different. They're even different from themselves. So parenthood and improvisation is, they're so close. Maybe it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. And even parenthood and leadership. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah,
it's a leadership role in that sense.
Yeah.
What do you think, Vibeke? Can you see something here?
We all teams started to work from home, and that's something that's really apparent to everybody's. Sort of living that at the moment. So maybe we can let it roll for a little bit, and then we could, meanwhile, talk a little bit about what is improvisation. How do we define it so we get a better understanding of it?
Yeah, and there was also a question, it's way up there now, but what's the difference between creativity and improvisation? I would say there's no difference at all. Mm-hmm. I would say, like in very short terms, I would say that improvisation is spontaneous creativity. So it is everything that happens mindfully, externally to the human body. So it's everything that's practical. And if it's put some sense into it, it's improvisation. You can easily just close your eyes and just think, and that would be little improvisation in that. But as soon as you try to change the role somehow, it's irreversible, right? So you can't take it back.
Right.
And you can the only thing that you can change is the present. You can't change the future. Mm-hmm. You can't change the past, but you can't change the present. And that's the only thing that we can change. And the funny thing is that we change it all the time. That's what we do. So that means that creativity and improvisation is basically the same thing, the same phenomenon in that sense. Only the improvisational part of creativity, you can't take it back. It's practice, it's action. And spontaneity, one of the 2 components, as it were, in improvisation, means to be glued to the present, and creativity is something that we need in order to make sense of uncertainty. And if uncertainty is more than COVID-19, right? These uncertainties, what we're dealing with all the time. If organizing is uncertain, then creativity and spontaneity is what we're doing all the time.
Right. So would it be correct to say that improvisation is to act in the spur of the moment, without preparation?
Without preparation, well, I'll have to say that preparation can be sort of at least in 2 different ways. So preparation could be the sort of preparation that we always possess through training, through our skills. So we're prepared for this very moment, the 2 of us, for slightly more than 30 years. I'm thinking, right? So we bring with us all this preparation to this meeting right here and now. And also you can show them, right? You can show them your preparation for this particular meeting. Right? This is really, that's a good one. So you have a specific preparation for this very meeting here. And we might get back to your preparation. I have a similar one. Mine is digital, but we have prepared for this very moment. But but improvisation without preparation is hard to imagine how that could be, because that's saying that creativity could exist like in vacuum or something, that it could be acontextual, and I believe it can't be.
Right.
Does that?
Yeah, that makes sense. So that, I guess, that also takes it into to talk about tools.
Yeah. So whenever you prepare for something, whatever you're prepared for, either through like general work experience that you've learned from, and for particular events, whatever you prepare creates a tool. Right? But what we know about tools, tools are nouns. So a tool is everything that you can say or an before, right? So a tool, a screen, a structure, a plan, a schedule.
strategy.
As strategy, definitely. So, but we know about nouns that they really don't exist. They're temporary objects, like all objects. So they have to be breathed into life. Improvisation is how you do that. So no improvisation without tools, and the greater the preparation may be, the easier it is to handle a particular situation that you're in. Like this, that Rick is saying that preparation is foundational for effective improvisations like jazz. Indeed. And jazz is interesting in that regard because many people do not like jazz music. I do, and maybe Rick does. But for people who don't like jazz particularly, still jazz has a way of showing these things very explicitly. How you can use musical notes and scales as tools to deliver a specific musical expression creatively, right? So tools and improvisations, they're bound together. They're mutually constitutive, I would say. Yeah.
So should we acquire to try to find the best tools for that? Is that the idea?
Oh, that's a very good question. What is a good tool? I would say, what do you mean? What do you think is a good tool?
I think that would depend on the context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Context is king.
Yeah.
So what's a good tool in one setting isn't necessarily a good tool in another setting.
Right.
And the way to judge that is by way of improvisation again, which means it sounds like as if improvisation is everything now, and maybe it is to some extent. But what makes a tool effective? Well, it's a context. In order to answer that, you have to be sensitive to whatever context you're in.
Yeah. So it'd have to serve the higher purpose of the organization or whichever challenge you are facing.
Indeed. Yeah. And strategy is a very good example of that, because sometimes strategy can be used like a written down explicit strategy can be used as an excuse to not do whatever is needed, because it says right here that we need to do this. It's wrong. It won't be effective. Right. But if you do it, nobody will yell at you because you're just doing whatever is written down. Yeah. So you continue doing something which is not suitable for whatever situation you're in, but it is defined that you won't do anything wrong in that sense. So yeah, but then again, strategy can be very valuable for improvisation if it's used as a guidance of sorts, right? Right. But too often I find, both in my consultancy work and as a researcher, I find that strategy is used, plan is used, more like a restraint jacket, really. I have this fun. I'm a friend of mine, a colleague from Oslo in Norway. He's a professor also, and he tells this story about these two guys who meet on the street. And the one guy says, "Well, I just invented this hairdresser machine," right? And the other guy says, "Well, that's impossible because no two heads are alike." And then the first guy says, "Oh, well, not after, Yeah. Okay. I can probably tell that. Right. Using the hairdresser machine, all heads are alike. Only after the actually hairdressing, yeah.
But I also found it really interesting, of course, because we just briefly had time to talk before that the results of your own research in this improvising is really the same that I came out with in my own research. How I just call them dominant logics are consumed in an organization or a department, and it was so interesting with my own research because I started 2007. So in 2008, when the financial crisis came, it was a different kind of crisis, and but still got to study the reactions to it. And it was exactly the same. You continue to do what you did yesterday. You could not sort of adjust to a new environment. So I'm thinking, so in that case, we definitely needed the improvisation skills. I was thinking more in terms of it being an open mind. But it also that we need the will to improvise, right? Because I thought that was kind of key, because we can, a little later, I would like to talk about, so how do we cultivate this improvisation mindset? But before we can even start cultivating that, we need the will to improvise.
Well, if particular organizational culture is prone to finding errors and really striking down on errors, like, then the best thing you can do as an employee in that company, in that organization, is not to make an error, right? Mm-hmm. So if that sort of management ideology takes hold of an organization of a particular, it could be a public organization or private, doesn't matter. Right. Then it's really hard to encourage people to improvise, because you won't be able to be contextually sensitive, because you'll be rewarded or punished, all dependent on how skilled you are in not making an error. Right. And that I don't know if you guys listening to this are familiar with the Dreyfus model, 5-phase model of a practitioner and maturing throughout a work life. But that's pretty much the difference between the level 4 and level 5. Whereas level 4 is not making errors, being skilled, like a technician. Then level 5 would be practical wisdom. So at level 5 you'll find an expert who, like, very close to the way we recently spoke about knowledge workers. People who thrive in dealing with uncertainty, people who have their shoulders down and are able to use their contextual gaze, as it were, to find whatever solution, whatever practice is the right one in this particular situation. What is good practice, right? Right. Whereas on level 4, the second highest level of in Dreyfus model, you'd be very skilled at doing a particular trade, right? Without making faults, without making errors. But you typically have high shoulders, and being stressed out so as to not make errors. So whenever the moment of truth arises, you tend to do whatever you know what to do or how to do. Right. Which would not be that would make for an expert practice, more of I don't know. And does that touch your question?
Yeah, I understand it totally. I mean, it's very easy for leaders to fall back on what they know, because then they know the consequences of those doings, and this is what has sort of been fruitful in the past. But when we reach these times of transition, then it's not the case any longer. So, but yeah, how do leaders like use this kind of improvisation, and how, if we assume that they have the mindset for it themselves, because that's an assumption, right? So how do they cultivate? How does the leader cultivate an improvisation mindset and a culture in an organization?
Well, that's an improvisational skill in itself, right?
Yeah.
So it would be dependent on the context, but I think it should be possible to point out some guidelines, right? So one way of talking about it is what would not work. Right? So what would not work would be like, John Cleese, the famous British, I guess he's both a philosopher and a comedian, I guess, in my view at least. He has this saying that to live a good British life is to be able to go to the grave without having embarrassed yourself at all, even once, right? So if you haven't made a single error, that means you've lived a good British life or an English life. And this is pretty much the same thing. If you as a leader sort of encourage that sort of behavior, stick to your agenda, stick to your plan, your structure, then you risk ending up getting exactly what you're asking for, right? Over-controlling, oversteering may have the same consequences, as you wouldn't turn on the heads of the workers that you really need to be improvising for you, because they wouldn't dare to. And also to learn how to improvise and to hone improvisational skills throughout the organization, it takes time and patience, and to be able to take risks. Right. Like it was Rick, I think, who said something about jazz music. Like these people, these guys, jazz is so many things, but the jazz players who are really good at improvising, what they do is that they train for years to be in places they've never been before, right? So they get used to being in a place that is like without security line. No, what's it called? The security web, whatever. Okay, whatever.
Okay.
Right. Doesn't matter. So they're trained at being in a new place.
Right.
And they know that, the world has a tendency of not going under, right? Mm-hmm. So they have sort of, but that takes time.
That's right? Like safety net.
Safety net.
Sorry,
yeah.
I had to
safety net.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that safety net is something that any leader can, show both as a role model and through his or her practice. That it's there, right? Mm-hmm. So,
Erlend, can I just quickly improvise here? Because I see that tons of questions in the chat, and I feel like I want to bring some of those in because they're very good comments in regards to what you're just talking about. So one was about this, what can you do as a leader? You started to talk about this, and what are the tools that people can use actually when you want to facilitate that? Because obviously there was a great comment in the chat about creating some like space for the people that work for you in order to feel actually safe to improvise, because as you said before, there's this failure culture that we have in organizations. So from your experience, maybe outside of academia and within academia, what are some of the tools or techniques that people can use?
Well, it's a very good question. But the thing about techniques and tools is that a tool that works for me doesn't. Maybe it may work for you, Vibeke, or you, Ingo, but there's no way to ensure that. Even a technique that could be used for good purposes in my organization can be used for negative purposes in your organization, as Tyrone just implies up here in the chat. But still, I think there are some techniques or tools that can be used. I think that conversation isn't, to have authentic conversation with your employees about what is good practice for us, like open, authentic conversation where it's possible to critique whatever's going on. Which means that as a leader, as a manager, you have to be open for input from your organization. And if you do that regularly, if you structure that, like make that a routine thing, instead of meeting your guys and your employees and meeting them and just handing them information that you could otherwise just send by email or whatever, if you have this unique opportunity to actually meet your people, talk with them, right? Take the risk to whatever comes up, and if you do that over time, and you put, maybe 1 hour every Thursday afternoon from 2 to 3, right? Really, you can do that, and you can, and whatever comes up through those conversations, you can use that as a tool for further organizational development. I actually do that myself in my practice as a consultant, and I also encourage the managers that I train and coach to do the same thing. But it sounds easy, right? Just talk with your people, but it isn't. Because often managers are afraid of losing face, and also they put this pressure onto themselves that they should have all this toolbox of solutions for every kind of situation. So they tend to hand out solutions to problems. And the thing is, if you start doing that, what will happen the next time your people have a problem? Well, they'll come back and ask you again, and they'll expect you to have a solution, and then you have this evil cycle going on, right? So it's I don't know who it was, but someone said something about leadership is parenting, or the other way around, and this is it. When your kid is 18. That's the point where he or she should be able to go out in the world, not needing your guidance. Yes, that's all right, but not needing your input as much as a 10-year-old. And last metaphor, because this is a good one, from the world of theater, right? So I don't know if this is an international thing or just a Norwegian thing, but the director of a play in Norway always has 12 weeks to make a play up and running, right? And in those 12 weeks, from the start of where the director is the only person who has any idea what's going to happen, the actors know little, and during those 12 weeks, at the end of them, the director needs to have breathed life into his leadership role in such a way that he or she is not needed anymore, right? So it's quite, you're actually working in a way so as to make yourself, I don't know the English term for it actually, but so that you're not needed instead of making sure that you are needed, right? So it's sort of a thwarted logic of sorts. Does that make sense, Ingo?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think what you mentioned in terms of the leadership style, I would characterize it when it comes to improvisation, I think is completely different from what we traditionally have. And it certainly required, as it came up here in the chat, a lot of courage. And it also requires, I think the underlying word here is role modeling. So actually being the one that creates the space, is trusting, is creative, like engages openly in conversations about failures, about challenges, and fosters like a dialogue in which people trust to actually make comments, make failures, and kind of improvise. And there's way more in the chat that I could read out, but there were a couple of interesting comments here. So if you like paying attention to the chat, there is Michael, who talked about failing public on purpose to show how the improvisation process works. So again, adhering to this idea of leadership. There's Kay, who talks about showing vulnerability and share your own success and failures, because I think that's oftentimes not done, right? We share our successes, but not the failures. There is also a comment from Elena. And Elena, do you want to quickly clarify on your comment?
Sure, thank you. So the whole idea of just approaching things with logic and reasoning, or indeed showing empathy and compassion by being motivated emotionally, doesn't push us enough in what I call a leap of faith. A leap of faith is that inner strength we discover when we come to meet the unknown in its own terms. That is another kind of intelligence I have found in my research in the Norwegian military, no less, precisely because they risk their lives knowing what they're negotiating, life and death, and do so by remaining centered, oneness with the circumstances that they're meeting, using their reflex and their energy. And for me, this sensuous approach that extends beyond sensibility and sensitivity to understand salience is where the trick of improvising lies. Thank you.
Oh, lovely. Hi, Elena. Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you.
I think it was a very good point when it spoke to me in terms of like, where is your locus of control? I think in most organizations, it's outside of you. There's something bigger that controls you. While in improvisation, you like put the locus of control inside of you. You trust your own agency. You trust your own kind of ability, and you feel trusted, which is like kind of a vehicle that helps you to express yourself in these ways. So thank you, Elena. Thanks for that point.
And I think that kind of goes really nice with Kathy's comment as well. Emotional intelligence is key. So true leaders need self-awareness here, the means of understanding their bias, modeling, and all of it. And I think that kind of goes nicely into what you said before, because the path of least resistance might be one of the most costly paths to take. So we really need to listen particularly closely to those people in the organization who are, if they're on the floor and resisting that strategy. And I think that was also the point before. We don't want to just bulldoze it through, because if people are resisting it, it's probably because there's something wrong with it. And that can be difficult also from top echelons to notice what is wrong with it. So thank you, Kathy, also for that pointing that out.
Yeah, well, you could, Ingo wanted You wanted me to say something about tools or techniques. One tool, I guess, is to just say embrace errors. But it's a dangerous thing to say, because that may, it's not about making errors for the sake of making errors, right? But which other way is it possible for any organizational member to learn about like anything, if not he or she tries? And if he or she tries something in an unknown terrain, and it turns out, it didn't work at all, that's the moment of truth. At least he or she tried, and if that was sort of sensitive for whatever this organization is going to do, well, that's what you should do. But if the manager or the leader just strikes down on an error just once, right, the whole organization will learn from that. I'll never dare to try anything new again. So it's just what I mean by embracing errors is that take them seriously. Self-awareness came up here, not only for a leader, but for everyone. But how is it possible for organization members, for knowledge workers, for employees to find that without the leader doing that him or herself? So role modeling, definitely. Sensitivity to whatever is going on. So just ask yourself, I don't know what's going on here. You can say it out loud. I have no idea what's going on. Can you help me? Right. So in Norway, we have this fantastic thing that we have the Norwegian model. Right. I wrote about it in the first article back in 2016. And the Norwegian model of leadership is co-determination. It's a democratic idea of how to lead. And it goes back to the roots of what it means to be Norwegian, really. Doesn't mean that we make this thing go perfectly well in all settings, in all contexts, not at all. But it is a not unspoken value. And it means it means many things, but it means that everyone's voice should be heard to some extent, right? In the manner that every employee is important. Every employee should have a say. That does not mean that everyone should have equal much to say about everything going on. That's just impossible. So you have to structure this somehow. And there are many models of how to do that. But co-determination means that, we're all about authentic conversation. That means we're all about making our employees responsible. And also knowing that this is going to sound a little bit radical, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. You can't really change your organization, right? You can only change yourself, but you can provide guidelines, tools, and be a role model for people to change. And the way to do that is to help making your workers responsible for their actions, so that they can improvise. Right.
But let's just for a sake of experiment say we have a department with 40 people and they all start improvising. I know this is probably not going to happen, but we would need some kind of direction on it.
Yeah, exactly.
So Tyrone was pointing out that not all improvisation is necessarily great. It can be a trial and error situation. But how do we take leadership on that?
Well, again, it's contextual, right? But 40 people, to make some sort of structure, when I say you can't change your organization, that doesn't mean that leadership is is ineffective, because it's not. That's not my point.
No.
Definitely, you can do many things. Just being there. In some situations, it's enough just to acknowledge the presence of others, like of your workers, of their contributions. But maybe it's not even you as a leader who has to do that. Maybe it's enough for you to create some sort of routines or arenas when people can see each other and learn from each other. Like in my profession in academia, I'm guessing there are a few things that makes professor more happy than being cited or quoted by another professor, right? So it doesn't have to be my dean, right? Probably doesn't need to be him at all. It should be someone else that I respect, someone that I can learn from. Well, I don't know if that.
No, it does. And I also like, this is also about motivation. So we also want to come back to that. I mean, how do we create this mindset of improvisation so it becomes a source of motivation and innovation? Because we sort of like backwardsly touched upon it. We know what it does. If it's not there, then the knowledge workers, or they sort of become mentally suffocated because they cannot no longer be creative, or they can't create meaning in what they're doing in the workplace. I mean, what are your thoughts on how we can create motivation?
Well, motivation is, I think, as we mentioned in the intro, I think at least for passionate workers, for knowledge workers, it's about meaning. It's about a meaningful work life. If you don't experience that whatever you're doing is meaningful and it's part of your identity, it could be hard to sort of find motivation in your work. And what we're seeing, I think, is right now, especially in this COVID-19 situation, is the significance of the workplace as part of not just meaning in your trade, but for you as a human being. So alienation and all kinds of things are sort of giving us pointers as to the significance of the workplace. As you could say motivation, but as a source of meaning, which in turn can be seen as motivating, I guess. You're motivated because you find meaning, not the other way around.
I think that's also an important point. I think you touched upon it before, and I just want to point it out that we had a comment here in the chat by, I think it was Carl, who said that please comment on the importance of compensation incentives in aligning behavior. And I think that's how organizations are traditionally ruled, right? So that's more the intrinsic motivational part, extrinsic motivational part. What I think you are adhering to, Erlend, is like the intrinsic motivation, the things that like when we talk about meaning, when we talk about purpose, when we talk about like taking agency, these things are usually not inspired by external like stimuli in terms of like, okay, this is what you have to do, this is what you're rewarded for, but it usually falls a little bit outside of like what is expected or maybe allowed.
Definitely. And also recruiting people, right? Like, so how are you supposed to recruit people if the only way to lure them into your organization is in monetary incentives or other incentives? And how do you keep your people?
Right.
Especially, sorry?
I just want to say, Michael made a great point here about egocentric hiring. So people hire people that they see as an extensions of themselves instead of like hiring people that they support to become better and serve the organization instead of like their own ego. So just want to like add that. Definitely.
And Tyrone also has a good one. Would you keep doing your job if you were not paid? At least I think it's Anthony Quinn who talks about, he's a famous researcher, he talks about a deep change. And one of the points he's making in his book, I think this is back in the 90s, 91 or something, 95 actually, if I remember correctly. And it says, you should ask yourself, would I do this job if I wasn't paid? And Tyrone says, he's a professor, he lives in England, and he says, he would. And
don't tell anyone.
No, don't tell anyone, I won't. Fantastic. That's so great. And I would too. And, you don't become a scholar to make money. That's just how it is. And you don't become a jazz musician, whatever, or an actor or whatever to make money, or a knowledge worker maybe, right? So I realize that we've talked a lot about this knowledge work is not really going into what it means, but just to passion, right? Which is I know it's important for you and the Managed Magazine credo. It's a good question to ask yourself. Would you be doing this if you weren't paid? I don't take Tyrone's question to be a binary thing, like, okay, so I would or I wouldn't, so I'll stop doing it, because I think it's a balancing act. But as a matter of meaning and identity and value, you should ask yourself that question. And as a leader, you should try, I think, to cultivate this culture, organizational culture that you're looking for by focusing on whatever makes everyday work for your employees meaningful,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that is,
Yeah.
right? So, and how do you know what it is? Oh, you just ask them, right? Just ask them. And so often we don't. Many of the leaders I work with, they don't dare to because they don't know what's going to, land in their laps, right?
Yeah.
So they're afraid to ask. So they just continue with this tacit understanding that they think they know what's driving them, but they actually don't know.
Right.
So as soon as we ask them, all kinds of stuff comes up. And just to be asked is nice, right? So
yeah, that's true. And I don't know if Søren Filbert is here with us today. He was signed up, but out at Creta, they've done amazing studies on meaning, on external and internal meaning. So the passion is sort of turning into that we want to contribute to like a higher purpose, something that's outside of ourselves. But there's also a structural meaning, and that especially goes for like social workers. So if, for example, you have an elders home and you want to talk to the old people there to provide them some comfort or entertainment in their life, but you're not actually allowed to spend that much time on them. So in that sense, there are structural barriers that are confronting or working against that higher meaning. And there was another point that I thought I wanted, and this is something that I want to give credit to Tyrone actually, because he pointed me at one point to self-leadership. Tyrone, you sent me your inaugural lecture, and it was not just the next strategy or the next empirical. It was actually about your own life, and that opened something up. That was a real eye opener for me. That we are all leaders, So if you have a life, you are a leader because you are a life leader. So I think sometimes we need to also put that forward. These things are for all of us. And it comes with the joy and responsibility for all of us also being a leader. Yeah.
That's a very good point. That makes me actually think of coming back to Ingo's questioning, just what kind of instruments, what tools and techniques. I just thought of something that Frank Barrett, is a scholar too, and he's written very, very interesting texts on improvisation and also using that jazz metaphor a lot. And one of the things, one of the terms he uses is provocative competence, I think, which means a leader should possess should try to sort of try to create settings where people can do something else that they were used to do, like encourage different sorts of action. Like, why do you do this? Like, just ask the question or demand that people do something else at least once in a while, so that they don't fall back to whatever routine that they have. And also it's sort of a way of spurring what's it called, double loop learning thing, right? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Yeah. And that's a healthy thing to ask yourself once in a while, both as a leader and in any trade, I think. Yeah.
And also going back to what you said before, we can't like the fundamental notion of behavior. You can't change another person's behavior directly, but you can change your own behavior and hope that it's going to have a positive response or a mirror effect in the other person.
Right.
So, I mean, I want to share like something I experienced this morning. I came into a kindergarten with my son, and we have never seen this woman before. And this is just you have to imagine 5 seconds. She came dancing out and she said, "Welcome, Storm. Your friends are waiting for you." And she said, "We're going to do great stuff today." So I was thinking, wow, this is leadership in 5 seconds. She has, I saw it totally mirrored on his face. She had managed to give him excitement about going in there. She'd given him comfort. She had given him, like the comfort of being with his friends in a few seconds and stuff. In 5 seconds, this is what you can do, as a human being. We take responsibility of that kind of life.
That's beautiful.
Leadership. I thought it was really beautiful. Yeah, I really thought. So. But so I don't know. Do we have to round this thing? Should we summarize some of the points, Ingo?
We could, but given that the chat was super active today, so thank you for everybody who commented. It's like I had a hard time following. I can imagine that you guys also had a difficult time like taking everything in. So I just want to use 5 minutes and if there are burning questions or things that came up, there were a couple of things like, okay, is there a negative example by Tyrone of improvisation? Where should it not be used? Do you have like a real life example where like it totally went wrong, right? Or can improvisation go wrong? I don't know. That was one question. Then there were a couple of others. So if you have a question, let's take the last 5 minutes. This is your chance. Just put it in the chat. And I would like to invite Erlend to do a one breath answer on the questions that he gets in the spirit of improvisation. Let's see if it works.
Can I answer the one that you mentioned about can it go wrong?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
It goes wrong all the time. That's the point. It goes wrong all the time. It's not about perfection. There's always faults, and you know, you can have a flow of like improvisational flow in sports, in your it's so you shouldn't focus on perfect as an idea, as an ideal for improvising, because even today we've had our flows today. We made our preparations, and you know, it was good at times, but sometimes I felt, oh, I lost. Well, I'm not accustomed to speaking English, for instance, right? So, okay, so that was, and that could be very unsettling, making those sort of imperfect, you know, utterances, whatever, right? But you should just go on and try and do better the next time, or actually, you should try to do better right now, right here and now. And that's what we try to do. So it's always it goes wrong all the time, but it doesn't matter.
And I think that's like echoed in the chat here by, for example, Thomas, who says like wrong is the new right during improvisation, or Kay, who says that improvisation is about experimentation. And Kathy says, yes, improvisation is risk and learning, celebrating learning and mistakes. If you're improvising and pushing the envelope, there should be things going wrong.
Exactly.
Yes, of course. And I think that also like shines a nice light on this question in terms of when to use it and when not to use it. Obviously, like large organizations are large for a reason, because as you say, Erlend, they improvise all the time, but within boundaries. And Tyrone had a beautiful question about like, are there different types of improvisation that you see?
Okay, so I usually divide improvisation into two different types, but you know, they're not really that different. They belong to, they're mutually constitutive, I think. But the one type is the positive, proactive sort of improvisation. It's a sort of brainstorming thing or whatever, when you define an arena and say, well, today we're going to improvise. Let's see what we can do, right? Which is that you voluntarily choose an arena, a meeting, whatever, and you say, well, let's see what we can make out of this, right? Or improv theater is like that, and so many aspects of work life, a brainstorming meeting, whatever. That's proactive, positive improvisation. But you also have this negative, the reactive form of improvisation, which is whenever something occurs, something happens, and you didn't invite it, right? It just happens. And it happens all the time. Like, what aspect of work life does not happen suddenly? Ask yourself that. You know, I've never come across anything that does not happen suddenly. Like suddenly the phone rings. Yeah, of course. How else can a phone rings other than suddenly, right? So all this suddenliness, I don't know, I just made that word up. A general suddenliness that sort of urges people to improvise all the time, which also answers another thing that you mentioned, Ingo, that when is it not right to improvise? I can't really picture a scenario when you don't improvise. What does it mean? Because
too much firefighting.
Well, okay, if you're in a situation and you experience the level of firefighting, like all these unexpected turbulency just taking hold of you, right, controlling you. Definitely, that's the context. Well, then you should start looking at, there are two types of fire. I don't know how much time I have. There are two types of fire, right? At least, right? It's a way of dividing. Well, one type of fire is a sort of fire that tends to occur at the same place, same sort of time, every week, every month maybe, or at least maybe even every year, I don't know. That type of fire is a fire probably telling you that there's something that you should routinize, right? So there's something to learn from that. Other types of fire, they're impossible to predict, right? And they do not tend, they're unrecognizable even, right? What kind of fire is this? These are fires that points to a certain complexity, so sort of problems that needs your genuine creativity, where it's not enough just to apply some routine or structure or whatever.
It just makes me think about when we say that we would like to use this improvisation or in leadership to create innovation and motivation. So what if we feel that we are not quite equipped for that? So how do I, as a leader, train to be a better improviser?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it all depends on who you are. I think Vibeke has probably, Vibeke and Erlend, we have different ways of going about that. But I think at least you should ask yourself some of these questions, like that we've discussed earlier. Right? Like, would I be doing this if I wasn't paid? Is this meaningful to me? And also, do I? Is my work a place where I can find authenticity, where I can learn more about myself, and obviously trying to take a risk once in a while. And if complexity doesn't find you, you should find it, right? Which means just putting yourself in certain situations where it's possible to learn something about yourself, but nobody could force you to do that, right? So that would all come from a question that you're asking yourself: is this the work life I want to live and have? If the answer is yes, well, it's really hard to but I think if people dare to ask themselves questions that go deep enough, at some point, I think most of us maybe would find it meaningful to challenge whatever belief system, whatever practice you have, and maybe go deeper.
Okay, so it could be I could become a better improviser by being more self-aware, by being more vulnerable, perhaps by finding more courage. And this is one of, I think it was Kay was mentioning also in the chat earlier on.
Yeah. And stop beating yourself down only because you make an error, because all practitioners make errors all the time.
Right.
It's not about that. It's about what you do, what you learn from them, and how you apply that, in your practice. And but people are, many of them, the managers that I work with, they're scared to death of how other people perceive them. Right. So they're so afraid of, not being perfect. Yeah. Which is weird because nobody's perfect, but we have this ideal now that's just Yeah.
Somebody said that the day you don't care about how other people view you, then you're unstoppable.
Yeah. Then again, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Some people need to be stopped. Yeah, that's true. But so how do you know that? So you make sure that you have people that are I don't know if it's allowed to say that, have the balls to question your actions, right? And question doesn't mean radically critiquing or beating you down. Just make sure that it's possible to talk with you.
Yeah, feedback.
Constructive feedback.
Right.
Yeah. And work on it. Like, improvisation is hard work. Like, the best improvisers I know, they spent their whole lives on being places I haven't been before. And by place, I mean mental places, or not just necessarily physical places. So it's a lot of imitation to find your own voice, right? A lot of tools in your toolbox, before you learn how to not use them at all. And maybe Peter Erskine, he's a famous Grammy awarded drummer. He more or less invented rapid drum playing, right? So he's a great player. And he said in a master class some years ago, he said that, to me, he says, he's a drummer, right? To me, the art of playing music is knowing when not to play. The space between the notes. So, because if he plays all the time, there's no room for others to play, right? So to create this tension, these openings for others, not using your tools, that's maybe the greatest of all arts when it comes down to improvisation.
Right.
And I think that also plays or addresses Vivian's question here, who says that I'm starting a new team whose members have never worked together before. How would you suggest I could start creating an improvisational environment or mindset through remote work and digital communication channels?
Oh, that's a good one.
A good question.
What do you think, Vibeke?
Yeah.
Oh, be patient. Be a role model. Be patient.
Yeah, don't be afraid to fail.
Yeah.
No.
Make it possible for people to share. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
To know themselves and to let other people know who they are, but not you shouldn't expect like this to be up and working like the next day, whatever, right? In a week or so. It takes a lot of time to build trust,
Mm-hmm.
and so little time to tear it down again. But to build trust takes a lot of time. Try to make people do something simple that they know how to do, so they can be comfortable from the start of.
Yeah.
And because that could be a brilliant point of departure for like deeper, maybe more radical improvisation later on.
Mm-hmm.
But people should feel safe enough to start sharing, right? That wasn't such a bad idea.
And I also want to want to try something out here, because Kay Ross from Hong Kong just texted me, and she was like, hey, I have some principles from the world of theatrical improvisation that she could share around this topic. So Kay, would you like to just unmute yourself and share a little bit?
Thank you, Ingo, and thank you, Erlend and Vibeke. You've talked a lot about improvisation, and I wanted to share some ideas from the world of theatrical improvisation that I think are very relevant, because I perform improv, and I'm also what's called an applied improvisation trainer, which means taking the principles and mindset of improvisation off stage into life and work. So some of you may have heard the famous improvisational mantra saying called yes and. Anyone heard of yes and? Thank you. Yes. So that's the mindset that we use when we perform improvisation on stage in a team. And it means accepting what the other person says or does and then responding to it. It doesn't mean you have to like it or agree with it, but it means having an open mind and being willing to listen to what people say. So off stage, it means, having that open mind instead of immediately saying yes, but when someone makes a suggestion. Yeah. So it's just going through life and work with a willingness to stop and listen, really truly listen to what somebody else says before you jump in with what you wanted to say and interrupting them. Another thing that we say in improv is make your teammates look good. It's a team sport. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about telling jokes and being funny. That's not what improvisation is all about. But we make our teammates look good. It's not one person being the star of the show. So it's a team thing that's very applicable off stage as well. We also say be willing to be changed by what happens. So going into situations with the willingness to listen to other people and change your mind or change direction, change the company's strategies, change direction. So be willing to be changed instead of going in with a fixed agenda about how things have to be. And it's about making bold choices. And it's about probably the hardest one is about being comfortable with the unexpected, being comfortable with uncertainty, change, risk, failure even. So lots of things about the way that people perform on stage in a team without a script are very useful in life off stage. So I think that's very relevant to everything that Vibeke and Erlend have discussed here this evening.
You just have demonstrated by jumping on this, and offering your support here. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you, Kay.
Thank you.
Next time we should start with Kay. That was just beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay, so With that, I would like to thank you all for staying with us here a little bit over time and contributing so much in the chat. I really enjoyed it. There was a lot of stuff. Sorry if we didn't attend to everything. There was a lot in this session. And I feel like every time we do something about improvisation, there's a lot of interest. So I'm sure we will have another session on the topic of improvisation somewhere in the future. And some people are nodding here, so thank you. And maybe that one should be even more improvised. So with that, I wish you all a good afternoon, day, or morning. I know Kay is like 1 o'clock in the morning or something like that. It's crazy. And I hope to see you next week. So next week, Tuesday and Thursday, once again, we have sessions. Check them out on schoolofbecoming.org. And with that, thank you so much for joining us a final time, and bye-bye.